So we can start with the first talk by Professor LUCKEN.
Yes, it's my pleasure being here today. Very excited with this conference workshop on Nakai. As it has been pointed out yesterday by Steve, at the time of his death, Nakai was not such an important figure that we could have imagined that 75 years later, an international workshop would be held in order to assess his legacy. And in fact, if this event is taking place today, of course, it's thanks to Steve and the Nanzan Institute. But it's also because of the great deal of work that has been done on his text after his death by intellectuals who quoted him and published his works. Among these intellectuals, Kuno Osamu, Tsurumi Shunsuke, and Suzuki Tadashi are perhaps the three most important. Kuno edited, as you know, the complete works in 1981. Suzuki Tadashi edited Bigakuteki Kukan, Aesthetic Space. That was a very important essay in 1973. And Tsurumi encouraged the publication of essays on Nakai, including the first biography written by Kinoshita Nagahiro. Kinoshita Sensei was one of the students of Tsurumi at Doshisha. When we look at where these intellectuals are standing, we can say that they are at the edge of two major currents, Marxism on the one hand and pragmatism on the other. Kuno is more of a Marxist. He also wrote about pragmatism. For instance, in 1963, he edited a volume including translations of Peirce, James, and Dewey. He and Tsurumi, of course, he contributed a lot to the recognition of pragmatism after the war. His books include American Philosophy, How to Understand and Develop Pragmatism. This is in 1950. Pragmatism in 1955. What Can We Learn from American Thought in 1958. And Introduction to Pragmatism in 1959. And finally, Suzuki Tadashi put a lot of effort in introducing pragmatic reformers in Japan, such as Nakai Ushikichi and Kano Kokichi. And yet, strange as it may be given this background, little has been written about Nakai's understanding of pragmatism and American pragmatism in particular. In the philosophical field, and some of the presentations we had yesterday were in this line. So we have his readings of Kant, of Marx, of Heidegger, of Miki, of Cassirer, of Nishida have been carefully analyzed, but hardly any papers, as far as I know, dwell on his relationship to pragmatism, and in particular on the place of William James and John Dewey in his thinking. All we have are broad statements, like, for instance, Mashita Shinichi, who was one of Nakai's friend in the 1930s, but member of the Sekai Bunka group, saying that his friend Nakai was somehow pragmatist. However, recent works by Goto Yoshihiro and Matsui Yuki show a new inflection in this direction. So the aim of my presentation today is to continue along this path, but in order to make my presentation more lively, I'd like to address, and also because I mainly gathered documents, I will address this topic through a somewhat provocative question, that is, who is the traitor? Was it Nakai, who turned away from his useful ideals to embrace the victor's logic after his appointment to the Diet Library in 1948? Or was it American pragmatism, which failed to overcome his own boundaries, as suggests the fact that when some SCAP officers learned about his cancer, Nakai's cancer, they couldn't help but feel relieved. First, we'll have a look at the main places where Nakai refers to pragmatism, then we'll relate this element to his work in the Diet Library and his collaboration with American officers during the occupation. And then we'll conclude by asking whether Nakai should have ended up rejecting America had he lived longer, like Tsurumi, for instance, The aim here is not, of course, to transform history into fiction, but to think about the possibilities and limit of American pragmatism at a time when the Pax Americana set out in the aftermath of the New Deal is under violent attack. So we know that Nakai was influenced by Nishida, whose initial interest in William James is well documented. We also know that Nakai paid close attention to the work of Miki Kiyoshi, who published an important essay called On Pragmatism and Marxism in 1926. However, there are very few explicit references to pragmatism in his pre-war essays. He mentions James in the logic of the committee, but the reference isn't clear and doesn't seem very significant. After the war, and in particular after 1958, however, things are very different. Nakai has moved remarkably closer to American pragmatism. This is particularly obvious in Bigaku Newman in Introduction to Aesthetics, one of his last major texts. It was published at the end of July 1951, and this little book includes in its final pages an ambiguous acknowledgement of James and Dewey's work. We're going to have a look at it now. So first, here is what Nakai writes about William James. So you have the Japanese here, and I'm going to quote partly in English. So in his book, The Principle of Psychology, that is an 1890 major book by William James. So I quote, James makes a radical critique of Kant and Hegel, in other words, of all philosophy which he describes as a farce. However, if he speaks of psychology to designate what he is standing for, it is indeed a foundation of philosophy that he has in mind. He also totally rejected the notion of substance and deconstructing it on the grounds that it is no more than a stream or orientation of consciousness. I'll skip a little bit. James was the first to experiment in his own way with what Cassira would achieve 20 years later in Substance and Function. What's more, he has apprehended the notion of direction long before Heidegger introduced it into philosophy in Being in Time, and so on. So as you can see, Nakai definitely proves James' critique of philosophy and idealism, and he is also placing him ahead of Cassira, Heidegger, Husserl, so three among the major references for pre-war Kyoto School thinkers. But what is also striking is that James seems to be praised for one of the main reasons why Marx and Lenin were also quoted in the logic of the committee in Inkai no Dondi, namely to criticize idealism and the concept of substance. However, Nakai rejects what he sees as a dull procedural aspect of James' thinking. And I quote again, if James managed to make philosophy a science, he has also made it tasteless. He has reduced it to some of a grey stuff more than he thought he would. And he adds, like the pretty little river twinkling under the sun that one day finds itself caught into the drain. And I don't know if you have in mind the famous Miyazaki movie where at the end you discover the Chihiro movie, I forgot the title. Spirited Away, that's it. Where the whole plot seems to be, it's the dragon, I forgot his name, but it's all about a little river that has been conducted into a little drain, and I'm wondering if it's not coming from here. It could be, strictly speaking. Haku, that's it. That's the feel. So let's turn now to Dewey. The remainder of art as an experience was not published in Japanese until 1952. But there were already some papers in Japanese about his conception of the art, such as A Problem of Art Criticism for Dewey, published in Shiso in 1950. And in any case, So I'm not sure that Nakai has read art as experience extensively in English. The elements he found there seem to have struck him deeply. I quote. So this is page 2. With Dewey, the opposition between subject and object was transformed into an opposition between organism and environment. The existential logic that takes Heidegger, for example, from Zeigen to Zug, is presented by Dewey in the form of instrumentalism, a social collective mode of organization, which is a far more innovative approach. And then Nakai goes, I quote again, in Dewey's theory of art, there is the idea that when some action done within the frame of a real experience manages to find its own rhythm, then will arise unconsciously an unexpected feeling of fulfillment. A new experience appears, grounded upon all the organic means of communication. This is the essence of the artistic experience. So it's a very strong acknowledgement of Dewey's philosophy. You won't find anywhere in Artist Experience, just to tell you about this little quotation, when you have a quotation in Nakai, like I said yesterday, it's always very intriguing. You want to trace it back to the source. So you have the medium, in passage D, medium organic means of communication. It looks like a quotation. It's not a quotation. I checked. There's nowhere in Artist Experience a sentence with starting with medium and then going on with organic means of communication. But definitely these words and the whole discussion ambiguously refer to a passage from a chapter entitled The Varied Substance of the Arts in Art and Experience, where Dewey elaborates on the immediacy of emotional effect. To quote him, in particular, in the case of music, it's page 237, 240 in the original edition. And I'm wondering, in fact, if this little medium organic means of communication is not to be understood as medium as organic means of communication, because if you look at the Japanese, you have the shokanke no yukiteki na kyotsu na baikai, which is the kyotsu na baikai, it's means of communication or medium that are common mediums that are organic, yukiteki, and shokanke that are unifying everything. So maybe a clue to this passage that has been quoted quite regularly by different authors. More importantly, it's fascinating to see how this positive, innovative organicism that Nakai perceives as the core of Dewey's aesthetics echoes his own description of aesthetics. The passage that is here underlined in passage in D is very similar to what Nakai describes as the climax of aesthetic experience in the first part of the book. That is supposed to be his own understanding of aesthetic, because the second part is the history of aesthetics. So if you have a look to the E passage at the end, you will find, for instance, this sentence, in the same way, when a sound is communicated to us through the ears, the whole body may begin to vibrate in a general movement that runs from the feet to the fingertip. It's completely in line. His own description of the aesthetic experience and how he defines art as experience in Dewey coincide very much. So it makes no doubt that Nakai became very interested in pragmatism during the occupation, which is not, of course, surprising at all, considering the period. Among the first papers published in Shiso after the war was a text by Shimizu Ikutaro on Dewey and religion, and many other followed. But what is surprising in the case of Nakai is that in the same time, he seems to have lost his interest in Marxism that Kyle pointed out yesterday. Because in Bigaku Newman, he's not mentioning anymore those texts that he was quoting before. So at first sight, it seems that there was an important shift in his thinking before and after the war, which could lead us to say with Kinoshita Sensei that he should be considered as a Tenkosha and not as a Hitenkosha, as Tsurumi thought he was. Even so, there's still something about Nakai that doesn't fit well with pragmatism, which is a principle of necessity. Whereas James refuses to consider the course, you probably all know that, the course of events in terms of the must be, to which he opposes the logic of the maybe. Necessity is everywhere to be found in Nakai thought, even after the war. In Introduction to Aesthetics, for instance, the way he describes the effect of modern capitalism as a process where, I quote, man reduced to a mere fragment found himself caught up in the Brownian motion of particles colliding against each other, clearly show that for him, the flow of the human world is always dialectical, that it is always coming up against things that cannot help but oppose, reflect, and distort it. So if Nakai is to be considered a pragmatist, it is then a Marxian form of pragmatism he's trying to invent, which set him apart from mainstream American pragmatism, which rejects dialectical thinking. I mean, at least for the mainstream part of it. So I'd like now to confront what we've seen here in Nakai's text with historical elements. It's a bit dubious in terms of methodology, but I hope you will forgive me. I wanted also to introduce some documents. So first, I'd like to clarify something. From the perspective of the history of philosophy, of course, pragmatism corresponds to a rather short period of time at the turn of the 20th century. In any case, when Dewey published his last text in the 1930s, in the philosophy departments in the US, it was already considered as a bygone movement. But it's very different from the angle that is my angle of intellectual history, according to which pragmatism refers to the common mindset and intellectual background of several generations of reformists active in the US in different fields of knowledge between the 1910s and Rorty would have said until the 1960s. I think it could be even going further. Educators, sociologists, anthropologists, librarians, curators, publishers, foundation officers, diplomats, and so on and so forth. So to come back to our topic, I argue that pragmatism was a driving force behind many of Washington and SCAP decisions, SCAP being the military government installed by the US and the Allied in Japan after the war, concerning Japan after the war. It's obvious, for instance, in the field of school education, where Dewey's theory, as you may know, have been implemented here literally out of the book, but you'll get to the same conclusion if you look at the philosophy books that were offered to Japanese libraries after the war, or if you look at the program of the American Studies Seminar organized by Stanford at Todai in the 1950s, and so on. Therefore, most of the American officers with whom Nakai was in touch was when he was at the Diet Library, which also means when he wrote Bigaku Nyumon, can be considered as pragmatist in the broad sense. It goes from Paul Burnett, from SCAP, Civil Information and Education Section, to Werner Clapp, the deputy librarian of the Library of Congress. He was a renowned New Dealer who came to Japan as part of the mission on libraries. But I should also mention Charles Faz from the Rockefeller Foundation, that was a Japanologist that Nakai met a couple of times. And I will introduce a little bit the documents later. As you may know, Nakai was appointed as vice president of the National Diet Library. It's mainly because he had their support. Nakai was indeed perfectly fitting with the profile they were looking for. He was experienced, but not too old. He was open to the world and to intellectual debates. He was socially progressive, but concerned about civil rights and individual freedom. Nakai may not have traveled to the West, but he was able to read English and German, and last but not least, he was not a communist, though he had strongly been influenced by his reading of Marx. Despite the outcries coming from some right-wing librarians who were against Nakai's appointment, the first meetings he had with American officers were very positive. You can see, for instance, in the documents you'll have on section 4 from 1948 onward. And you see that this bunch of people at the beginning, starting with Justin Williams from the government section, that was already a very elite position in the SCAP, had a very good perception of Nakai. Though before the war, America for Nakai epitomized the reign of the machine, the land of speculation of profit. For example, the example of the 1936 Ford and the logic of the comedy. What he discovered when working with his American counterparts was that their approach to knowledge was very new and very exciting. It's clear to me that he had the feeling that the theoretical proposals that he had made before the war and the logic of the comedy could find their actualization through a close collaboration with them. You can see this in particular in papers like Soshiki Toshite no Toshokan e Libraries as Organizations, or Toshokan no Miraizo, The Future of Libraries, or even in his last major text, Chosa Kikan, Structures of Verification. You can see how he tries to emulate what MacLeish and Clapp did at the Library of Congress. So new ways of cataloging, indexing, referencing, microfilming of collections, speeding up of data transmission, and so on. So all the American innovations appealed to him. So under the beacon of pragmatism, because all those innovations, at least at that time, were perceived as pragmatic innovations, and thanks to the experience he had acquired through the Diet Library, I think his entire pre-war discourse was kind of revitalized. However, despite the positive opinion American officers initially had of Nakai, so as we've seen, things quickly went wrong with the Red Purges that started in 1949. Hanigoro, who had supported Nakai from the outset, was ousted from his position as chairman of the Diet's Library Committee. Nakai immediately got in trouble. He was investigated twice, the first in 1949 by a parliamentary committee, then a second in 1941-52 by the Special Investigation Bureau of the Attorney General's Office. However, according to the report, you can see here it's in section 3. You have it, I give you the full transcription here. You can find it if you're interested in the document in the Diet Library, in the SCAP GHQ archives. According to this report, Nakai is not a communist nor even a sympathizer. And it's also striking to see that in Rockefeller Foundation officer Charles Farr's diary, you can read that in particular in section. Which one is it? I think it's I forgot which one it is, but you'll find it anyway. The document is here for the reference. That Nakai would even be more on the right than Kanamori, who was appointed thanks to the full support of Prime Minister Yoshida. And I quote, according to Justin Williams, however, Kanamori now strongly believes in Nakai, says he is even more conservative than Kanamori himself, and that Kanamori, will resign if Nakai is forced out. If you know what I've wrote about Nakai and how I position Nakai, you can understand that these kind of documents were a bit, unsettling for me. Nevertheless, these rumors left a lasting print. By 1951, 1952, Nakai seems to have lost much of his glow. At a time when a new page was being turned in the relation between Japan and the United States, US officials seemed much more inclined to trust the Japanese old guard than the reformists that they had initially supported, so much so that, as I said previously, the news of the cancer that took Nakai's life in May 1952 was greeted with some relief. I quote, you can see it in the last quotation, April 18. So she thinks a visa for him would be out of question, and he has been won of those demanding that the former CIE libraries be turned over to Japanese Library Association to run and not be run by the future US Embassy, how he did. So what can we conclude from the sequence? For Tsurumi Shunsuke, Nakai, and all the Sekai Bunka group had, of course, in mind to organize a popular front, but American culture was there from the outset. That is Tsurumi Shunsuke's perception a few decades later. Jazz, Hollywood movies, the New Deal are all to be found in Sekai Bunka, according to Tsurumi. This is the reason why they helped him after the war. I quote Tsurumi. I understood then why the survivors of Sekai Bunka, Taketa Nimitsu, Nakai Masakazu, Kuno Osamu, Wadayuchi lend us a hand. Their support was not based on tactical considerations, on the idea that the best option would be to pledge allegiance to the American way of thinking while Japan was occupied. It was based on the fact that these people who had suffered from the 1929 crisis and had been looking then for a way to transform the social system found after the war and the New Deal something that resonated with their own aspirations during the 1930s. It's in the little leaflet that goes with the Kuno Osamu Shu, published in 1998. So what we've seen above confirms and extends to the mistake that Nakai and his group were kind of New Dealers. Nakai's interest in William James and John Dewey after 1935 and his admiration for the reforms undertaken by MacLeish and Clapp at the Library of Congress show how close he was to American progressive thought and pragmatism in particular. But it also means that if Nakai rejected Marxism after the war, he didn't reject the reasons why he was interested in Marx before the war. But now how can we explain that Nakai was rejected by the very people he admired? We're coming here across a well-known phenomenon that Tsurumi himself confronted, namely that pragmatism in its post-war American version, and probably even today, is struggling to manage its contradiction, or more precisely, while it is open to any positive, constructive criticism, it has a messianic dimension that turns into, defense mode, if not sometimes in violent mode when its incremental reformism is denied. Tsurumi's analysis, and perhaps Nakai would have made the same point had he lived longer, is that pragmatism cannot be achieved in its true form within hegemonic spaces. Because if you are in a hegemonic position, and if at the same time you refuse that the world is driven by a necessary dialectic process, if problems are only side effects to be addressed from the perspective of your positive thinking, you have nothing to remind you that you are in a hegemonic position and that your faith and methods align with your own interest. To sum up, if Nakai shifted from a Marxist framework before the war to a pragmatic framework after 1948, in the end, the change is not that significant, for the Marxist approach you can find in the logic of comedy has this kind of agility, this kind of movement that characterized pragmatism, and the pragmatic touch in the post-war text don't make it disappear the principle of necessity that goes with dialectical thinking. So, as you can see, we have kind of a mix of pragmatism and Marxism, which is not, as you know, something that belongs to Nakai. It's a defining feature of 20th century Japanese progressive thought, from Miki Kiyoshi to Tsurumi, Ryama Shunpei, and arguably up to Karatani Kojin nowadays. Even if you can find similar examples elsewhere, for instance, Habermas is very famous for this. I think it's particularly strong current here in Japan, but it has never been conceptualized as a current, nor do we have a clear view of its origin and common baselines. And if I may, I would definitely think that there is a task here to be carried out by younger scholars. 以上です。ご清聴ありがとうございます。
You mentioned at the outset the influence of Dewey and James, particularly related to James. It's American pragmatism that influenced
Okay.
most. But how about Peirce? It seems to me that that his fundamental ideas are the closest, almost an overlap to many of Nakai's ideas. And Tsunami never quotes Peirce, I think because he didn't like his idiosyncratic language and his schema. Maybe the same thing is true of Nakai, but in his semiotic theory, and which overlaps with everything I've heard yesterday today about Nakai's notion of cinema, and the idea of a community of knowledge, in the role of media and community of knowledge. But Peirce saw the community of knowledge as a critical tool. So it is aimed at not only transforming habitual modes of thought, but also criticizing them. The community of thought was a self-cleansing and internally self-monitoring system. And his semiotics, sign, index, symbol, ends with the symbol, which is the cultural language, and how the symbol both poisons and enhances habitual mode of thought. And Nakai has this idea of ideological conditioning, and as how that distorts aesthetics. So all of this, just ideas thrown together, seems to me that it would really be worth. I mean, maybe there's something in the text, maybe not, but it would really be worth doing a comparison there, because I think it's astonishing. As I was listening to you talk, it couldn't help but think.
Thank you so much. I mean, for this insight, because so historically speaking, as you know, P.S. was recognized lately, even in the U.S., and his collection of essays have been published late, and in Japan. So he probably belongs to the first generation who has some awareness of who P.S. was, because he was in Harvard in the 1930s, and he discovered and got a lot of interest in P.S. but through Charles Morris. So he's not quoting him a lot. He's mentioning, I mean, he's writing a little bit on P.S., but not much. And it's always in an indirect way that it is referring to P.S. as far as I know. Nakai, I think, had no idea of who P.S. was. I think in the immediate post-war, as I said, in the pre-war, he seems to be absolutely unaware of the importance of pragmatism. So obviously has not checked into this material. And in the post-war, it's not even from 1945. I would say it's from 1948. So he had just a 5-year span, and 4. And so he read James, Dewey, probably not extensively, and I'm sure he had no. I think he had no direct reading of Pierce.
Just a footnote of historical interest. John Michael Kreis, who's probably one of the most esteemed Kassir experts, his thesis is that there's a great similitude between Peirce and Kassir, and actually suggests influence somehow. Never being able to follow it up. Peirce scholar, but this is one of his primary interpretations of Kassir and how to link it.
That's very interesting, because it could explain, this kind of why somebody like Nakai was feeling in his world when quoting Kassir.
Yeah, especially this idea of a community of knowledge combined with the idea of fallibilism. That's the core of Peirce's thinking. Fallibilism. How do you keep that alive?
And it's so strong with Nakai too, of course.
Questions of texts. It's being illuminating from both sides.
Thank you.
Peirce was very abstract, proper for a logician.
Thank you so much.
So I have a question. If I'm understanding correctly, the claim is partly that up to this point of, let's say, 1948 or maybe post-war, there's a shift at some kind of level from Marx to pragmatism. And kind of writing later and looking at this when especially in this first thing from Byakunyumon that you're quoting, of course, as we know, all of these other people are also figured, right? Phenomenology, Heidegger, and so on. So I'm wondering what happens to those figures and those ideas in the schema of kind of like from Marxism to pragmatism. And this is one of the challenges for Nakai because he's so all over the place with so many different kinds of things. And so I'm wondering how you would understand that or think about those different aspects. Yeah.
Different aspects. So of course we should look more carefully, but my feeling is that, so there are two things. First, there still are some Marxist elements in Byakunyumon, as the little quotation I did shows, when he is talking very much in materialistic terms. But there are no more quotations, even hidden quotations. And the name of Marx, if as far as I remember, doesn't appear. Nor Lenin's name, and so this connection seems to be kind of broken. And on the other hand, I mean, Cassirer, Heidegger, and all the history of philosophy is still there. This has not changed. The Greek philosophy is still there. I mean, it hasn't disappeared. So and last point I should have said is that this quotation on Dewey and James are at the very end. It ends with this. He makes a little footnote afterwards, 1 to 2 pages, to explain that yes, maybe we have this new opportunity now to catch up with modernity, but let's be cautious.
Thank you so much here. It's really exciting. I was wondering just how you would say you would think about the shift from Marxism to pragmatism in terms of Nakai's broader intellectual trajectory, because it does seem almost, I think you could say it's in continuity with how his pre-war writings unfolded, because he's a functionalist. Then he discovers Heidegger, he disavows functionalism, but functionalism remains. He's a Heideggerian, he discovers Marxism, he disavows Heideggerian, but Heideggerian concepts remain. He becomes a pragmatist, he disavows Marxism, but Marxist concepts kind of remain. And so this is almost like the ultimate pragmatic move as well. Like he's a pragmatist before, when the historical moment shifts and it's no longer in vogue to be Heideggerian, or Heidegger gets outed as supporting National Socialism, he shifts away from him. He assimilates. Maybe that's too Hegelian Marxist, but he integrates the concept as much as he can. But he moves into a different framing. And is this just a continuation of this kind of approach to almost like riding the currents of the moment? Maybe.
I don't know how far we can go in that direction, but you can imagine that I'm. It's on the table. Yes, it's one of the options that seems to be the more valid, and I wanted to make this point, but I don't know how far I can go yet. I think it has to be, we have to share a little bit ideas about that, because some elements could go in another direction.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So, my question is, how do you appreciate Nakai's writing in the first half of the 1930s? So in these writings, if I'm mistaken, so he mentions the American New cultural movement, and so he doesn't affirm 100%, but so he regards them as a transition toward a new form of culture. So
yes, it's true that the last Tsurumi's quotation go in your direction. I mean, it's true that in Sekai Bunka, in Bihihyo, and all those texts of the 1930s where he is talking about popular culture, or at least his editing text by some of his friends on popular culture, the US is definitely is there. So Hollywood, and jazz music. So it's part of his interest. So yes, I think that's why it would go in the opposite direction, or that means that he would have been aware from the beginning that in the US there was something of a new liberal, progressive-oriented thought that could challenge Marxism, but so it has to be looked upon more carefully.
Thank you for insightful presentation. I have several questions, but I want to hear only one question. And do you think that pre-war Nakai already had influenced from the thought of view, or Nakai himself defined his essential philosophy within the philosophy of doing or pragmatism?
Thank you for your question. It goes in line with the two previous questions, and I don't think he's aware of Dewey and the importance of pragmatism as a philosophical current at this time, but he how, I don't know. So maybe Kyle could find some documents. What have you been reading? What the we should go and look at Bihihyo, and so he was aware that there was a progressive movement in the US, and that the relationship in particular to masses through culture was something that should be considered, to say the least. But was it more than that? I don't know. I don't know how far it was conceptualized. Probably it was not. Because in his text, main text, in particular in Inkai no Dondi, it's only rather negative comments that he is doing about American culture in general as the country that promotes industrialization, mass production, alienation of the people, and so on.
Thank you. And I think there are close link between Miki and Nakai, in my opinion. So, and the logic of imagination in the chapter 3, technology, Miki refers to the thought of technology brought about by Dewey. This thought is closely related to the Miki's philosophy's core. That is, what is katachi? He refers to the philosophy of Dewey. Is it likely to
Oh, I mean, this is definitely, I mean, the kind of insight that I was looking for in this presentation.
Yeah.
And I'm very glad I'm participating in this workshop because precisely, I mean, I'm a historian and I'm working in intellectual history, and to have this kind of it's so yes, of course he was aware of what, because you know he was admiring a lot Mickey's work. So I'm sure that he managed, at least indirectly, to grab something from pragmatism through these texts. If, as you say, the question of technique in Dewey is at the core of Mickey's approach.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And I learned that
Thank you.
pragmatism is important. Yeah, I think I agree.
確認します。
Thank you for interesting presentation. I'd like to ask about the acceptation of pragmatism in Japan. Pragmatism is mainly accepted in philosophy of education area. And after World War II, Nakai worked at the library. So in broad meaning, he worked at the area of education. So maybe he started to study Dewey, maybe. And after the war, philosophers at Kyoto School, Kyoto University, they, like Nodamata, they start to study pragmatism. Or maybe Japanese philosophers try to accept something more American, maybe after World War II. So I wonder, Nakai try to share the movement in Japanese philosophy world.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I mean, definitely, it's one of the main issues I'm struggling with. I've been looking at many documents of the post-war period, and for instance, these quotations from Charles Faas are really fascinating. Charles Faas is a Japanologist. He's among the first generation of Japanologists. Japanologists in the sense of Japan as a real studies, which started in the 1930s with people like Hugh Borden, Reischauer, Embry, Faas. So he was part of it, but he was not. He was appointed in the 1940s at Pomona College in California, but then he very quickly after the war entered in the Rockefeller Foundation, and he was in charge of the whole humanity program, not only for Japan, the world, the whole humanity program. So he was in charge of libraries, history, philosophy, and so on. Jimbo. And it's very interesting to look at what was his take on what the Rockefeller Foundation should promote as an American philosophy. It's not idealism. It's not German idealism. It's plainly written in his text. It's not Marxism, of course. And it is two things. It's comparatism, and in particular, the a comparative philosophy of religions that is at the core. And the second one is pragmatism and analytic philosophy. That is what he is supporting, giving money to. So on the one hand, he will support East and West, at Hawaii, giving massive funds to Hawaii. And on the other hand, they are pushing American philosophers to come here in Japan. So for instance, in the 1950s, you have Morton White, you have Donald Davidson, you have Frank Kenna, you have Abraham Kaplan, you have Van O'Quine, big names. They're all coming on Rockefeller grants. So it's just a way also to say that, yes, philosophers in Japan got interested in pragmatism and analytic philosophy after the war because maybe that was the philosophy of the victor, maybe. But it's also because the victor said, look at this. That's interesting. Have a look. And if you have a look, you'll have some rewards. I mean, you'll have some grants, you'll have some invitations, and so on. So it's a two-way process.
This might be the same question that I asked before, but maybe in a slightly different way. And that is, I'm curious and still not entirely sure how something like a liberal subject or an individual might function in Nakai's thought between kind of pre-war and post-war. And my sense is that if he begins with kind of an idea of saying, okay, part of this comes from my interest in film and this idea of shifting away from a kind of Zusauer, right, sort of like individual observer, Kantian subject, towards something else. I'm wondering sort of like what happens in the post-war, because partly I think that there's a shift towards what I might call sort of like liberal subject as a basis. And maybe that's in relationship to pragmatism, but pragmatism doesn't necessarily have to be that. Maybe if I think of like early James, for example. So yeah, do you?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for pushing me into that direction, because definitely there's something to be addressed here. I think that precisely this question of the individual is where there is a shift between, that is a fundamental shift, not only between Nakai and pragmatism, but between most of the Japanese academia interested in pragmatism and American pragmatism. Because I think that, how to say, I definitely Nakai retained a great skepticism about the ability after, he went to, during 1 year in 1920, if I'm right, into a temple, about the ability of the individual to get anything fundamental on his own. And I think it's only in his mind that what he says when he talks about his view on aesthetics, when someone, through effort and training, managed to let go, that he is finally in the right attitude. And I think it is, it's only, I think he can subscribe to pragmatism insofar as the people involved in a project are not constantly evaluating if their involvement, if the action is in line with their self-interest. That is at the core of pragmatism. Some kind of well-oriented self-interest. But rather, if each individual abandons himself in the collective task. It's that what he says before the war, that what he says after the war. And of course, there is something of a religious background here. He comes from Jodo Shinshu, maybe it has some connection with it, I don't know. But definitely it's and Tsurumi is in the same line. I mean, when it comes to the individual, they're not interested, or there is a huge divide between the positions.
Thank you.
And also it is, of course, related to the relationship to the medium. You have to abandon yourself to the medium. Nakai thought, I think. It's kind of transparency of the medium, of the lenses, of the cameras, the walls.
If maybe there are no other question. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much.